The apartment above the bakery smelled like cinnamon at 5 a.m., which was the only reason Sophia could stand living there. Rent was cheap because the building was old. The pipes groaned all night, and her window didn't quite close all the way, letting cold air slip through even in July. But the smell of bread rising downstairs made the whole thing bearable. She worked nights at the 24-hour diner 3 blocks over, which meant her sleep schedule was garbage, which meant she talked in her sleep sometimes. Her roommate Priya had mentioned it a few times, laughing about it, not thinking much of it. "You said something weird again last night," Priya told her one morning, pouring cereal into a bowl that didn't match its spoon. "Weird how?" "Like scared weird. You kept saying, 'Please don't let him find me.'" Over and over. Priya shrugged. "You okay?" Sophia's stomach had dropped. Just a little, though she covered it with a laugh. Bad dream. Probably. Work stress. That wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't even close to the whole truth. But Sophia had gotten good at half-truths over the last 3 years. Ever since she'd left Chicago in the middle of the night with 2 suitcases and a fake sense of calm she didn't actually feel. Ivan Kovalenko didn't let go of things easily. She knew that better than anyone. The diner was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that made the fluorescent lights buzz louder than usual. Sophia wiped down the counter for the 3rd time, more out of habit than necessity, when the bell above the door chimed. A man walked in. Tall, dark coat, dark hair, a little too long for anyone she knew personally, and something about the way he moved made her glance up twice. He sat at the far booth, the one nobody ever picked because the heater vent above it rattled. "Coffee," he said. Black, his voice was low, careful, like he was choosing each word before letting it out. Sophia poured the coffee and set it down, and when she glanced at him properly for the first time, something in her chest did something strange, a flicker of recognition she couldn't place. "You look tired," he said, which was an odd thing for a stranger to say. "It's 4 a.m, Sophia said. Tired is the job description. He almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough. He came back the next night, and the night after that. Always the same booth, always black coffee, sometimes a slice of pie he barely touched. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his questions felt oddly specific. "Have you lived here long?" "Couple years. Before that?" Sophia's guard went up immediately, an old reflex sharpened by years of looking over her shoulder. "Why do you ask?" "No reason." He looked back down at his coffee. "You have the look of someone who moved somewhere to disappear." Her hand tightened around the coffee pot. "That's a strange thing to say to someone you don't know." "I apologize." He didn't sound like he meant it, not entirely, but he also didn't push further. "I'm Adrian, by the way." "Sophia." "I know," he said quietly, and something in the way he said it made her skin prickle, though she couldn't have explained why. He left a large tip that night, folded under his mug, more money than the entire bill combined. Sophia stared at it for a long time after he left, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that she couldn't quite name. She told herself it meant nothing. Strange customer, generous tipper, probably lonely, probably just liked the diner's atmosphere despite the rattling heater and cracked vinyl booths. That's what she told herself at least, until the 3rd week, when she woke up to Priya standing in her doorway looking rattled. "You did it again," Priya said. "The sleep-talking thing. But it was worse this time." "Worse how?" "You said a name," Priya said. "Even. You kept saying, 'Don't let Even find me,' over and over, and then you were crying, actually crying, in your sleep." Sophia's blood went cold. She hadn't said that name out loud, not even to herself, in almost 3 years. Not since Chicago. Not since the night she'd packed everything she could carry and left without telling a single person where she was going. "I don't know who that is," Sophia lied. Priya's expression said she didn't believe it, but she didn't push either. That was the thing about Priya. She gave people room to keep their secrets, which was exactly why Sophia had chosen her as a roommate in the first place. That night at the diner, Adrian came in again. Same booth, same order, but something in his expression was different. Sharper somehow. "Rough day?" he asked, though it felt like he already knew the answer. "Rough sleep," Sophia admitted, too tired to keep up her usual guard. "Apparently I talk in my sleep. Scared my roommate half to death." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do you say?" "Nothing that makes sense," Sophia said, forcing a laugh that came out thin. "Random stuff. Nightmares probably about someone specific?" Sophia's stomach twisted. "Why would you ask that?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that felt like being seen too clearly, too completely, by someone who had no right to look at her that way. "Because fear like that doesn't come from nowhere, Sophia. Someone taught you to be afraid like this. You don't know anything about me. I know more than you'd guess," Adrian said quietly, and something in his tone made her chest tighten with a fear she didn't fully understand yet. "That's a creepy thing to say." "Probably," Adrian agreed, not denying it, which somehow made it worse, and also, strangely, more honest than she expected. She almost asked him to leave, almost told him not to come back, but something held her tongue, some instinct she didn't trust but couldn't ignore either, a feeling that this man, whoever he was, understood something about her fear that even she hadn't fully articulated to herself. Weeks passed. Adrian kept coming, kept asking careful questions, kept leaving generous tips folded under his mug. Sophia found herself looking forward to his visits despite every warning bell in her head telling her this was strange, this was too coincidental, this was something she should be more suspicious about. Then, one night, he didn't order coffee. "I need to tell you something," Adrian said, his voice different now, heavier, "and I need you to hear all of it before you decide I'm insane or dangerous or both." Sophia's hands stilled on the counter. "Okay, 3 years ago, in Chicago, you worked at a florist shop near Lincoln Park," Adrian said, and Sophia's blood turned to ice because she'd never told him that. Never told anyone in this city that detail. "You left in the middle of the night because a man named Ivan Kovalenko decided you belonged to him, and when you refused, he made your life something you had to run from." "How do you know that?" Sophia's voice came out barely a whisper. "Because I've been listening to you say his name in your sleep for 2 years, Adrian said quietly, "long before I ever walked into this diner." Sophia's legs went weak. She gripped the counter edge, knuckles white, trying to make sense of words that shouldn't have been possible. "That's not possible. I don't even know you." "You've never seen me before this diner," Adrian agreed, "but I've known about you for considerably longer than that." "That doesn't answer anything. That makes it worse." Adrian's expression stayed steady, patient, though something behind his pale eyes looked like it was bracing for her reaction. "I'm not human, Sophia. I haven't been for a very long time. What I am gives me certain abilities most people don't possess, including the ability to sense fear that calls out loud enough, even across distance, even in sleep." Sophia laughed, short and disbelieving. "You're telling me you're what, psychic? Some kind of dream reader?" "I'm a vampire," Adrian said simply, no dramatic flourish, just quiet fact laid on the counter between them. "And your fear, Sophia, has been reaching me in your sleep for 2 years, ever since you crossed into territory I've been quietly watching. This is insane." "Yes," Adrian agreed. "It is. That doesn't make it untrue." Sophia's mind raced through everything, the strange timing of his visits, the questions that felt too specific, the way he seemed to already know pieces of her past she'd buried carefully. None of it made logical sense, and yet something in his calm, steady delivery made the impossible feel uncomfortably plausible. "Prove it," she said, echoing an instinct she didn't fully understand. Adrian glanced around the empty diner, then back at her. "Are you certain? It's not something easily undone once seen." I need to know I'm not losing my mind. He nodded slowly, and then his eyes shifted. The pale brown she'd grown, used to bleeding into something reflective, almost luminescent, catching the diner's fluorescent light in a way human eyes never could. His canines lengthened slightly, sharp and unmistakable, before receding just as quickly. Sophia's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, I won't hurt you," Adrian said immediately, voice gentle despite what she'd just witnessed. "I've had 2 years to consider hurting you, Sophia, if that had ever been my intention. It never was." 2 years, Sophia repeated numbly. "You said 2 years. How does that even work? I sensed your fear the night you crossed into my territory, fleeing Chicago," Adrian explained. "Fear that intense, that raw, sometimes calls to creatures like me across distances that shouldn't logically be possible. I followed the pull, quietly, without approaching, simply to understand the source. So you've been watching me. For 2 years, without ever saying anything. I watched from a distance," Adrian corrected. "I didn't approach until I was certain you were safe enough to handle the truth, and until I could no longer justify staying away." "Why now?" Adrian's expression softened slightly. "Because your fear has been getting worse, Sophia, not better. Someone is getting closer. I can feel it in the way your nightmares have shifted these past few weeks." Sophia's stomach dropped. "Evans found me?" "Not yet," Adrian said, "but he's close. Closer than you realize. That's part of why I finally approached you directly, rather than continuing to watch from the shadows." "This is a lot to process," Sophia said, sitting down heavily on the stool behind the counter, her legs no longer trustworthy. "I know." Adrian's voice carried genuine sympathy. "I wouldn't blame you for asking me to leave and never return. But I think you need protection that goes beyond simply changing cities again," Adrian said carefully. "Ivan's resources have grown considerably since you left Chicago. Running alone won't work indefinitely." Sophia stared at him, this impossible creature who'd apparently been guarding her secrets and fears for 2 years without ever revealing himself. "And you're offering what, exactly?" "Protection," Adrian said simply. "Whatever form that needs to take." Sophia didn't sleep that night. Not properly. Replaying Adrian's revelation over and over until the ceiling of her small apartment felt like it was closing in around her. Priya noticed the exhaustion the next morning, but didn't ask questions, sensing correctly that Sophia wasn't ready to explain. She went back to the diner that night anyway, some combination of curiosity and desperation pulling her through the door despite every rational instinct telling her to stay away from the impossible man who claimed to be a vampire. Adrian was already there, same booth, waiting like he'd known she'd come. "I have questions," Sophia said, sliding into the booth across from him rather than staying behind the counter. "I expected as much. How exactly does someone find Chicago and end up connected to a vampire in some other city?" Sophia asked. "That feels like a stretch even by the standards of everything you told me yesterday." "Territory isn't defined by human city limits," Adrian explained patiently. "My influence extends across a considerable region, connected through old bloodlines and older agreements between my kind. When you crossed into that territory fleeing Chicago, your fear registered the way a scream registers in a quiet room. That's not comforting." "No," Adrian admitted, "but it's accurate." Sophia twisted her hands together beneath the table, an old nervous habit she thought she'd broken years ago. "What do you know about Ivan?" "Really know, not just second-hand information. Something dark passed behind Adrian's pale eyes. I know he's dangerous. I know he's spent considerable resources trying to locate you these past 3 years. I know his methods have grown increasingly aggressive as his search has repeatedly failed." "How do you know all that?" "Because creatures like me maintain networks. Sophia, information travels through channels humans don't typically access. When someone with resources like Ivan starts asking pointed questions in certain circles, word eventually reaches people like me. So he's actively looking." Right now. Yes, Adrian confirmed, watching her carefully for reaction, more aggressively than he has in the past year, from what I've gathered recently. Sophia's chest tightened with familiar panic, the same suffocating fear she'd carried since Chicago, the fear that had apparently been loud enough to reach across whatever strange distance connected her to Adrian's awareness. I need to leave. Pack up, disappear again, start over somewhere new. That's one option, Adrian said carefully, though I'd suggest considering alternatives before committing to it. Like what? Like allowing me to help you directly, rather than continuing to run indefinitely. Sophia studied him, this strange, patient creature who'd apparently guarded her secrets from a careful distance for 2 years. Why would you do that? What's in it for you? Adrian's expression flickered with something complicated, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Honestly, I'm not entirely certain myself. I've watched considerable suffering across centuries of existence, Sophia, and generally learned to maintain distance from human troubles that aren't directly my concern. But you didn't maintain distance with me. No, Adrian admitted. I didn't. Why not? Because your fear felt different, Adrian said slowly, choosing words carefully. Not simply intense, but persistent, resilient. You've spent 3 years running and rebuilding and running again, and despite everything Ivan's put you through, you haven't broken. That resilience is rare. Sophia, rarer than you'd probably guess. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite the seriousness of their conversation. That's an odd compliment. Perhaps, Adrian said, something almost warm entering his careful tone. But it's honest. They sat in silence for a while, the diner's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the rattling heater above their booth providing an odd, familiar soundtrack to an impossible conversation. If I let you help, Sophia said finally, what would that even look like? Protection first, Adrian said. Wards around your apartment. Additional security you wouldn't necessarily notice, but that would prevent Ivan or his people from locating you easily. Beyond that, we'd need to discuss more permanent solutions, depending on how aggressively he continues searching. Permanent solutions, Sophia repeated. That sounds ominous. It doesn't have to be, Adrian said. But eventually, Sophia, running stops being sustainable. At some point, the problem needs a more definitive resolution. You mean confronting Ivan directly? Adrian's expression hardened slightly. Eventually, yes, if he doesn't stop searching on his own. The wards went up within days, subtle enough that Priya never noticed anything different about the apartment. Though Sophia found herself sleeping slightly better within a week, the constant undercurrent of anxiety softening just enough to feel like relief. You seem less exhausted, Priya observed one morning, studying Sophia over her coffee mug. I've been sleeping better, Sophia admitted, which was true, even if she couldn't explain why. That guy from the diner, Priya said carefully. The one you mentioned. Are you seeing him? Sophia's cheeks warmed unexpectedly. It's complicated. Complicated how? He's helping me with something, Sophia said, which was true without being remotely the whole truth. It's not romantic. At least I don't think it is. Priya raised an eyebrow but didn't push further, another kindness Sophia appreciated more than she usually acknowledged aloud. That night, Adrian arrived at the diner earlier than usual, his expression tighter than Sophia had grown accustomed to seeing. What's wrong? She asked immediately, sliding into the booth across from him without waiting for an invitation. Ivan's search has intensified, Adrian said without preamble. He's hired additional resources, expanded his search radius considerably. I believe he's narrowed down your general location within the past week. Sophia's stomach dropped. How narrow is narrow? This city, Adrian said grimly. Possibly this neighborhood, depending on how thorough his most recent search has been. That's not possible. I've been careful, changed my name, paid everything in cash. Yvonne has resources most people underestimate, Adrian interrupted gently. Money buys access to information most people assume is protected. Someone, somewhere, likely made a mistake, however small, that his people managed to exploit. Sophia's hands trembled against the table's worn surface. What do we do? We prepare, Adrian said. Beyond the wards already in place, I'll need to strengthen certain protections. Potentially relocate you temporarily to somewhere more defensible while we assess exactly how close he's gotten. Relocate where? Adrian hesitated slightly. My home. It's considerably more secure than this apartment, regardless of how many wards I place here. That feels like a big step, Sophia said, though something in her chest, some instinct she was learning to trust despite everything, told her Adrian's suggestion made practical sense despite the emotional complexity attached to it. It is, Adrian agreed. I wouldn't suggest it if I believed there were safer alternatives available. Sophia studied him for a long moment. This strange, careful creature who'd apparently spent 2 years watching over her from a careful distance before finally revealing himself. Why do I trust you? This makes no logical sense. 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know vampires existed. Trust doesn't always follow logical timelines, Adrian said quietly. Sometimes it's built through consistency rather than duration. I've been honest with you since the moment I revealed myself, Sophia, even when honesty complicated things considerably. That's true, Sophia admitted. You could have lied about 100 different details. You haven't. I don't intend to start now, Adrian said. Which is why I need you to trust my judgment on this, even though I understand how significant a request that is. Sophia's mind raced through options, weighing the terror of Ivan's approaching search against the vulnerability of trusting a vampire she'd known for barely a month, with something as significant as her physical safety. Okay, she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. When do we leave? Tonight, Adrian said. I don't want to risk additional delay, not with his search this close. Sophia nodded, swallowing hard against the fear tightening her chest. I need to tell Priya something. She'll worry if I just disappear. Tell her you're visiting family, Adrian suggested. Something simple, something that won't require additional explanation or raise unnecessary questions. She won't fully believe that. She doesn't need to fully believe it, Adrian said. She only needs enough plausible explanation to avoid panic while you're away. Sophia left the diner that night, with her heart pounding, packing quickly and quietly once she returned to the apartment, leaving a note for Priya that felt inadequate compared to the truth she couldn't share. By midnight, she was in Adrian's car, watching the familiar streets of her adopted city blur past the window, heading toward a destination she couldn't fully picture, trusting a man she'd known for less than a month with the fragile safety she'd spent 3 years carefully constructing. Adrian's home wasn't what Sophia expected, not the Gothic mansion her imagination had conjured, but something more understated, a large converted farmhouse tucked into wooded hills outside the city, isolated enough for privacy, but warm-looking in a way that surprised her. This is yours? She asked, stepping out of the car into cool night air. Has been for several decades, Adrian confirmed. I prefer understated over ostentatious. Draws less attention. Inside, the warmth continued. Comfortable furniture, warm lighting, bookshelves that suggested genuine use rather than decoration. An older woman appeared from what looked like the kitchen, studying Sophia with careful assessing eyes. This is Helena, Adrian said. She's managed this household for longer than either of us probably wants to calculate precisely. 37 years, Helena said dryly, give or take, though he's terrible with exact numbers when it comes to admitting how long anything's been. Sophia found herself almost smiling, despite the tension still tight in her chest. Nice to meet you. You'll be safe here, Helena said, something kind entering her assessing gaze. Whatever's chasing you. This house has protected considerably more dangerous problems than one persistent human. That's reassuring, I think. It's meant to be, Helena said, already moving to prepare a guest room, leaving Sophia alone with Adrian in the warmly lit living room. How long will I need to stay here? Sophia asked. Until we've resolved Ivan's search satisfactorily, Adrian said, which could mean days, could mean considerably longer, depending on how aggressively he continues pursuing this. And if he doesn't stop? Adrian's expression hardened slightly. Then eventually, we'll need a more permanent solution. You keep saying that, Sophia said. Permanent solution. What does that actually mean? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to share. It means, if necessary, ensuring Ivan is no longer capable of continuing his search, through whatever means that requires. Sophia's blood went cold. You mean killing him? I mean ensuring your safety, Adrian said carefully, through whatever method that ultimately requires. I won't pretend that couldn't potentially include his death, if circumstances leave no reasonable alternative. That's a lot to sit with. I know, Adrian said. I wouldn't blame you for feeling conflicted about it. Sophia sank onto the couch, exhaustion finally catching up with weeks of accumulated fear and adrenaline. I spent 3 years hoping I'd never have to think about Ivan again. Now I'm sitting in a vampire's living room, discussing whether he might need to die to keep me safe. Life rarely follows the paths we'd prefer, Adrian said, settling into the chair across from her, careful distance maintained despite the intimacy of their conversation. Tell me something, Sophia said. Why did you really start listening? 2 years ago, when my fear first reached you. You could have ignored it. Most people, most creatures, probably would have. Adrian considered this seriously. I'd grown complacent, I think, in the decades before you arrived. Existence becomes routine after enough centuries, Sophia, even for creatures like me. Your fear felt like something worth paying attention to, something that cut through the routine in a way I hadn't experienced in considerable time. That's not really an answer. No, Adrian admitted, something almost embarrassed flickering across his careful features. I suppose the honest answer is that I found myself caring, somewhere along those 2 years of watching, in ways I hadn't anticipated or particularly wanted. Sophia's chest warmed despite the exhaustion and fear still coursing through her system. That's a strange thing to admit. Most things about this situation are strange, Adrian said, something wry entering his tone. I found myself rather unprepared for how thoroughly you've disrupted my carefully maintained routine. Is that a complaint? No, Adrian said, meeting her eyes steadily. It's an observation, and perhaps, if I'm entirely honest, a kind of gratitude I haven't fully processed yet. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, something warm and unexpected blooming beneath the fear still tight in her chest. This is a strange time to be having this conversation. Probably, Adrian agreed, though I've found most of our conversations happen at strange times, under strange circumstances. Maybe that's just what this is, Sophia said quietly. Strange, but somehow, still, working. 3 days passed in careful, watchful quiet, Sophia gradually adjusting to the rhythm of Adrian's household, Helena's brisk efficiency, the strange comfort of wards she couldn't see but somehow felt anyway, a subtle steadiness in the air that hadn't existed in her apartment above the bakery. She and Adrian talked most evenings, careful, exploratory conversations that gradually revealed more of both their histories than either had initially intended to share. Tell me about before, Sophia said one evening, curled into the corner of the couch, while Adrian sat across from her, firelight, flickering warm across his features. Before vampirism. You must remember something from being human. Adrian's expression grew distant, thoughtful. Fragments, mostly I remember my mother's voice, though not clearly enough to recall exact words. I remember a war that erased most of what I knew before it, including, eventually, my humanity. That sounds lonely. It was, Adrian admitted. for considerable time afterward. You adjust eventually, though adjustment isn't quite the same as healing. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? Older than this country, Adrian said, something wry touching his careful tone. Precise numbers become difficult to track after enough centuries. Sophia studied him, trying to reconcile the impossible scope of his existence with the careful, patient man sitting across from her. Does it get easier? Living that long? Sometimes, Adrian said. Mostly it becomes different, rather than easier. You learn to find meaning in smaller moments, since the larger arcs of existence stop providing the same satisfaction they once did. Smaller moments like what? Adrian considered this seriously. Conversations like this one, perhaps, genuine curiosity from someone who hasn't yet grown tired of asking questions. Sophia felt her cheeks warm again, an increasingly familiar sensation whenever their conversations drifted into territory this personal. I have a lot of questions, apparently, I've noticed, Adrian said, something almost fond entering his tone. I don't mind it, if that wasn't clear. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, firelight crackling softly. The isolated farmhouse settling into its usual nighttime quiet. Adrian, Sophia said eventually, what happens after this? After Ivan, I mean, whatever resolution that ends up requiring. What would you like to happen? Adrian asked carefully. Sophia considered the question seriously, surprised by how much thought it required despite the simplicity of the phrasing. I don't know anymore. 3 years ago, all I wanted was distance, safety, enough space to rebuild some kind of normal life. Now normal feels like it might mean something entirely different than I originally imagined. Different how? Different like this, Sophia said, gesturing vaguely between them. Whatever this is, conversations by firelight with a centuries-old vampire who apparently started caring about my well-being before I even knew he existed. Adrian's expression softened considerably. I'd like that too, if I'm honest, though I understand the considerable complications attached to wanting it. Complications like you being immortal and me very much not being immortal? That, among others, Adrian confirmed. I've learned through considerable painful experience that attachment to mortals carries a particular kind of grief that never fully resolves. You've loved someone mortal before? Something old and unhealed flickered behind Adrian's pale eyes, once centuries ago. It ended the way these things generally end, eventually, regardless of how carefully you try to prepare for it. I'm sorry. Don't be, Adrian said. It taught me valuable lessons about the risks involved in caring deeply for something inherently temporary. Does that mean you're not willing to risk it again? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Sophia's breath catch slightly. I thought that's exactly what I'd decided, for considerable time before you arrived in my awareness. I'm finding that resolve considerably harder to maintain than I originally anticipated. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm honestly not certain yet, Adrian admitted. Though I suspect, whatever the answer ultimately proves to be, it's already too late to change course entirely. The call came on the fourth night, Helena's expression grave as she found Adrian in his study, Sophia trailing anxiously behind her. Ivan's people found the apartment, Helena said without preamble. Broken an hour ago. Your roommate wasn't there, thankfully, but they tore through everything looking for information. Sophia's stomach dropped violently. Priya, is she safe? She's fine, Helena confirmed. Working her shift at the hospital, completely unaware anything happened. But they found enough there to confirm you'd been living in that apartment, which means Ivan now knows exactly which city to focus his search. Adrian's expression turned grim, calculating. How much time do we have before he narrows down this specific location? Difficult to say precisely, Helena said. Days, most likely, rather than hours, given how carefully this property's been shielded, but his resources have proven more considerable than initially estimated. Sophia sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling. This isn't going to stop, is it? He's not going to give up. Not on his own, Adrian confirmed, voice carefully controlled despite the tension evident in his rigid posture. Which means we're likely approaching the point where more definitive action becomes necessary. You mean confronting him? Yes, Adrian said. I'd prefer to avoid it, given the complications involved, but continued evasion doesn't appear to be a sustainable long-term strategy. What complications? Sophia asked. Beyond the obvious danger, I mean. Adrian hesitated slightly before answering. Ivan isn't entirely human himself, from what my sources have gathered recently. Something considerably less powerful than what I am, but enough to make direct confrontation more complicated than simply dealing with an ordinary human threat. Sophia's blood went cold. What is he? Details remain unclear, Adrian admitted. Possibly something touched by dark magic rather than a fully supernatural creature in his own right. Enough to explain his particular obsession with locating you, beyond ordinary human possessiveness. That's not comforting. No, Adrian agreed, though it does explain considerable aspects of his behavior that never quite made sense through purely human logic. Sophia thought back to those final months in Chicago, the way Ivan's fixation had felt increasingly unnatural, obsessive in ways that transcended typical controlling behavior. You think he did something to himself. Or had something done to him. It's possible, Adrian said carefully. Which would explain both his resources and his persistence, neither of which typically align with purely human capability. So what do we do? Adrian's expression hardened with resolve. We prepare properly, rather than simply reacting to his approach. I'll need to gather additional information about exactly what we're dealing with, and likely additional support beyond what this household alone can provide. You have allies? Other vampires? Some, Adrian confirmed. Relationships built over considerable time, favors owed and available to call upon when circumstances genuinely require it. This feels like it's spiraling considerably beyond what I originally imagined when you first told me the truth, Sophia said, exhaustion evident in her voice. I understand, Adrian said, something gentle entering his careful tone despite the seriousness of their conversation. I wish I could offer simpler solutions, Sophia, but Ivan's threat appears more complicated than either of us initially anticipated. Are you scared? Sophia asked suddenly. Of whatever this ends up requiring? Adrian considered the question seriously. I'm concerned, certainly, about the complications this situation presents, but I'm considerably more concerned about your safety than any personal risk involved in addressing it properly. Sophia felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite the fear still coursing through her system. You keep saying things like that. Things that make this complicated situation feel less terrifying than it probably should. I don't intend to minimize the genuine danger, Adrian said carefully. But I also don't intend to let you face it feeling entirely alone, regardless of how considerable the challenge ultimately proves to be. The following days brought careful preparation, Adrian's allies arriving quietly over several nights, each one studying Sophia with varying degrees of curiosity and assessment, before settling into whatever role their particular skills required for the confrontation ahead. You're important to him, a woman named Katerina observed one evening, watching Sophia help Helena prepare dinner in the farmhouse kitchen. I haven't seen Adrian this invested in centuries. We haven't known each other that long, Sophia said, feeling oddly defensive. Time doesn't always correlate with significance, Katerina said, something knowing in her expression. I've known Adrian nearly 200 years. He's never once brought a human into this household for protection. Not until now. Sophia's cheeks warmed at the implication. It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are, Katerina said, returning to her preparations without further comment. That evening, Adrian found Sophia on the farmhouse porch, watching stars emerge across a clear night sky. The isolated property finally settling into quiet after a day of tense preparation. Katerina mentioned something, Sophia said as he settled beside her, about this being unusual for you. Bringing someone here. Adrian's expression grew careful. It is unusual. Yes, why me? Really why? Not the diplomatic version you've given me before. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying the stars with an intensity that suggested he was choosing words carefully. Because somewhere during these past weeks, watching you fight through fear that should have broken someone considerably less resilient, I found myself wanting something I'd convinced myself I no longer deserved. Which is? Connection, Adrian said simply. Genuine connection, rather than the careful distance I've maintained for considerable time following previous losses. Sophia's breath caught slightly. That's a big admission. It is, Adrian agreed. Though I suspect, given everything we're facing together, honesty seems more valuable than careful restraint at this particular moment. I feel it too, Sophia admitted, surprising herself with the directness of the confession. Whatever this is, connection or something else entirely, I feel it too. Adrian's hand found hers on the porch railing, cool and familiar now after weeks of careful proximity. I won't pretend the complications don't exist. Sophia, my nature, the eventual grief that comes with loving something mortal, all of it remains exactly as difficult as I've previously described. But I find myself considerably less concerned about those complications than I probably should be, Adrian admitted, something almost helpless in his careful tone. Sophia leaned into his side, drawing warmth from his familiar presence, despite the underlying chill of his skin. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some things are worth the complications they bring. Perhaps, Adrian said softly, though I'd prefer we survive Ivan's confrontation before we spend too much energy contemplating longer-term complications. Sophia laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her with its genuine warmth, given everything looming ahead of them. Fair point. They sat together in comfortable silence, stars wheeling slowly overhead, the isolated farmhouse holding its careful, watchful quiet around them. Preparation for whatever confrontation lay ahead, settling into the background of a moment that felt, despite everything, unexpectedly peaceful. Whatever happens, Sophia said eventually, I'm glad you started listening. 2 years ago, when my fear first reached you. So am I, Adrian said, his voice carrying genuine warmth despite the tension of everything ahead. Though I suspect I should have approached you considerably sooner than I ultimately did. Why didn't you? Fear, mostly, Adrian admitted. Fear of exactly this, caring deeply for something inherently temporary, risking loss I'd convinced myself I couldn't survive experiencing again. And now? Now I've decided some risks are worth taking, Adrian said, regardless of how much easier careful distance might have proven. Even arrived on the 7th night, exactly as Adrian's network had predicted, though the confrontation itself unfolded with considerably more violence than Sophia had mentally prepared herself to witness. She watched from behind reinforced wards in the farmhouse's central room, Helena keeping careful guard beside her, while outside, shouts and unnatural sounds echoed through the wooded property surrounding Adrian's home. Stay here, Helena said firmly. Whatever happens outside, this room holds against anything Ivan's people might attempt. I can't just sit here while Adrian you can, and you will, Helena said, not unkindly but with absolute firmness. Adrian survived considerably worse than one obsessive human with borrowed dark magic. Trust him to handle this. Sophia forced herself to remain still, though every instinct screamed to move, to help, to do something beyond simply waiting for outcomes she couldn't control or predict. The sounds outside grew more intense, then gradually quieter, until eventually, silence settled over the property. The waiting felt endless. When Adrian finally appeared in the doorway, blood staining his torn shirt but expression steady, Relief flooded through Sophia so intensely her knees nearly buckled. "It's over," Adrian said. "Ivan's forces have retreated, considerably diminished from what I could assess during the confrontation. And Ivan himself?" Adrian's expression grew complicated. "Alive, though considerably weakened. He fled once it became clear his resources weren't sufficient to overcome what I'd prepared for his arrival. So he'll come back." "Possibly," Adrian admitted, "though I suspect it will take considerable time for him to gather resources sufficient to attempt this again, if he attempts it at all." Sophia crossed the room, her arms finding their way around Adrian despite the blood staining his clothing, relief overwhelming any concern about the mess. "You're okay." "I am," Adrian confirmed, his arms coming around her carefully. "Though I won't pretend this confrontation resolved everything as cleanly as I'd hoped." "What does that mean?" "It means Ivan remains alive, remains a threat, however diminished," Adrian said. "We've bought considerable time, Sophia, but not permanent resolution." Sophia pulled back slightly, studying his exhausted, blood-streaked features. "How much time?" "Months, likely," Adrian said. "Possibly longer, depending on how quickly he manages to rebuild whatever resources he lost tonight." "That's not nothing," Sophia said, forcing herself to focus on the positive despite the underlying uncertainty. "Months of safety is considerably better than what I had before." "It is," Adrian agreed, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with a resolution that fell short of complete safety. Over the following days, the farmhouse gradually returned to its careful, watchful rhythm, Adrian's allies departing one by one, Helena's brisk efficiency reasserting itself as the household settled back into something resembling normalcy, despite the underlying tension of an unresolved threat. "You could stay," Adrian said one evening, finding Sophia on the porch where their conversations had become a comfortable ritual over recent weeks. "Permanently, I mean. Rather than eventually returning to your apartment, to your previous life." Sophia considered this seriously, weighing the complicated implications against the genuine warmth she'd found within this strange, impossible situation. "What about Priya? My job? Whatever remains of my previous life?" "Those complications could potentially be addressed," Adrian said carefully. "Though I understand the significance of what I'm asking, given everything else you've already sacrificed running from Ivan these past 3 years. I don't know if I'd call it sacrifice, staying here," Sophia said slowly. "I think, somewhere during these past weeks, this started feeling less like temporary refuge, and more like something I genuinely wanted." Adrian's expression warmed considerably. "That's considerably more than I expected to hear, given everything complicated about what I'm asking." "Maybe complicated doesn't automatically mean impossible," Sophia said, echoing sentiments she'd voiced before but meaning them more fully now, after weeks of careful, gradual trust building between them. "Perhaps not," Adrian agreed, reaching for her hand with familiar, careful tenderness. "Though I suspect we'll continue discovering exactly how complicated this remains for considerable time ahead. I think I'm okay with that," Sophia said, leaning into his familiar warmth, despite everything still uncertain looming ahead of them both. 3 months passed in careful, watchful peace, Sophia gradually settling into a life that felt increasingly like home, despite its unconventional circumstances. Priya visited occasionally, confused but ultimately accepting of Sophia's vague explanations about seeing someone and needing space to figure things out, never quite pressing for details that Sophia couldn't fully provide anyway. The farmhouse had become genuinely comfortable, Helena's brisk efficiency softening into something warmer as weeks turned into months, Adrian's careful, patient presence a constant thread running through Sophia's days that she'd grown to depend on more than she'd initially anticipated. "You're sleeping better," Adrian observed one evening, finding her curled into the porch swing with a book she wasn't actually reading. "I am," Sophia confirmed. "No more nightmares about Ivan, at least not the way there used to be." "Good," Adrian said, settling beside her, That fear reaching me in your sleep, all those months ago, it was genuinely distressing to sense, even from a distance. I still can't quite believe that actually happened, Sophia admitted, that you were listening for 2 years before you ever approached me. Neither can I, if I'm honest, Adrian said. It's not typical behavior, even for creatures like me. Something about your fear simply demanded attention I couldn't ignore, regardless of how carefully I tried initially. I'm glad you couldn't ignore it, Sophia said softly. So am I, Adrian agreed, his hand finding hers with familiar comfort. They'd grown increasingly close over these 3 months, careful boundaries gradually softening into something neither had explicitly named, but both clearly understood. Sophia found herself thinking less about Yvonne's eventual return, and more about the strange, unexpected happiness she'd discovered within Adrian's careful, patient household. Can I ask you something? Sophia said. Always, if Ivan never comes back, she said carefully, if this threat simply fades away eventually, what happens to us, to this? Adrian considered the question seriously, something vulnerable entering his careful expression. I'd like to think we continue exactly as we've been, gradually building something worth the complications involved, though I understand if that answer feels insufficient, given the significant differences between us. It's not insufficient, Sophia said. I think I just needed to hear you actually say it. That this isn't simply protection born from circumstance. It never was. Purely that, Adrian said. Not for considerable time now, if I'm being entirely honest with myself. Sophia felt warmth bloom through her chest, something that had nothing to do with the careful physical warmth of the porch swing beneath them. I love you, she said, surprising herself with the directness of the admission. I don't know exactly when that happened, somewhere between the diner and this farmhouse, and everything complicated in between. But it did. Adrian's breath caught audibly, something raw and unguarded breaking across his ancient, careful features. Sophia, you don't have to say it back, Sophia added quickly. I just needed you to know. I love you too, Adrian said, voice rough with vulnerability he'd clearly kept carefully guarded for considerable time. I think I have for longer than I've been willing to fully acknowledge, even to myself. Since when? Since your fear first reached me, 2 years ago, Adrian admitted. I told myself it was simple concern, professional interest in a mortal's well-being. It became considerably more than that, gradually, without my full awareness until recently. Sophia leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the strange, quiet stillness where a heartbeat should have been, but wasn't. 2 years of listening. That's a long time to care about someone before ever saying anything. It was, Adrian agreed. Though I suspect, given everything complicated about loving something mortal, perhaps I needed that considerable time to convince myself the risk was genuinely worth taking. And now I'm considerably more certain than I've been about anything in decades, Adrian said, his arms tightening around her with careful, certain warmth. Ivan never returned, not in any form Sophia had feared during those anxious months following the confrontation. Word eventually reached Adrian's network that Ivan had relocated entirely, his resources too diminished to continue pursuing a search that had cost him considerably more than he'd anticipated when it began. You're certain? Sophia asked, finding Adrian in his study reviewing correspondence that had apparently confirmed the news. As certain as these things allow, Adrian confirmed. He's moved to pursuing other interests, according to my sources. Whatever obsession drove his search for you these past years appears to have finally, genuinely faded. Relief flooded through Sophia so completely she felt almost dizzy with it. After 3 years of running, that's hard to fully believe. Understandable, Adrian said gently. Some fears take considerable time to fully release, even once the actual threat has genuinely passed. Sophia crossed the room, settling into his lap with familiar comfort that had become natural over recent months. What happens now? Now that the danger's actually gone? Adrian's arms came around her automatically. Now, I suppose, we continue building whatever this has become, without the underlying urgency of imminent threat complicating every decision. I like that idea, Sophia said, tracing idle patterns against his chest. Just us, figuring out what comes next, without constantly looking over our shoulders. There's something else, Adrian said carefully. Something in his tone shifting slightly. I've been considering this for a while, waiting for the right moment, though I suspect there's rarely such a thing as perfectly right timing for questions like this. What kind of question? Adrian reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving something small that made Sophia's breath catch immediately. I understand the significant complications involved in what I'm about to ask, the mortality gap between us, the eventual grief that comes with loving something temporary. All of it remains exactly as complicated as it's always been. But? Sophia prompted, echoing their now familiar pattern. But I've decided, after considerable thought, that some things are worth the complications regardless, Adrian continued, opening the small box to reveal a ring, simple but beautiful, catching lamplight with quiet elegance. Sophia, I love you considerably more than I anticipated ever loving anything again, and I'd like to spend whatever years we're given together, rather than continuing to guard myself against eventual loss. Tears filled Sophia's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, despite having grown increasingly certain over recent weeks that this conversation was approaching. You're asking me to marry you. I am, Adrian confirmed, something vulnerable and hopeful entering his ancient, careful features. Though I understand entirely if the significant complications give you pause, or reason to reconsider. I don't need to reconsider anything, Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. I decided a while ago, somewhere during these past months, that I wanted this. Wanted you, complications and eventual grief and everything else included. You're certain? Completely, Sophia confirmed, extending her hand for him to slide the ring into place. I spent 3 years running from fear, Adrian. I'd rather spend however many years I'm given running towards something worth having instead. Adrian's expression cracked open with relief and joy that seemed almost foreign on features that had carried careful restraint for considerable centuries. Yes, then, whatever complications await us. Yes, Sophia confirmed, laughing through unexpected tears, to all of it. He kissed her then, gentle and certain, sealing a promise that defied every logical objection either of them could have raised about mortality and time, and the eventual grief immortality guaranteed. Outside, the farmhouse settled into its familiar, comfortable quiet. 3 years of running finally, genuinely, arriving at somewhere worth staying.